I'm thinking of a dream that many of us have from time to time. It's not the dream where you suddenly find yourself flapping your arms and you're flying over the Golden Gate Bridge. It's not the dream where you're suddenly back in school and the teacher just announced a pop quiz for which you are utterly unprepared. Or in my case, we're having a chair test in band and I know that I haven't played the tuba in well over 30 years. It's that other dream. Keep thinking about it and we'll get back to it. Now, this is now the third week in a row that Jesus has taught in a parable. And it occurs to me that we haven't really talked about what a strange kind of story a parable is. The New Testament scholar C.H. Dodd once defined a parable as a metaphor or a simile drawn from life, the meaning of which is sufficiently in doubt to tease the imagination into active thought. I've always loved that part, to tease the imagination into active thought. And a simple one-word definition for a parable is riddle. Preacher and scholar Tom Long says that a parable is essentially a riddle. And I need to acknowledge near the beginning of the sermon my indebtedness to Tom Long for my approach to the parable this morning. So the question is, how do we understand the riddle that is today's parable? We might try to understand the parable through this motif of the rich and poor that runs through the Gospel of Luke like a consistent thread. As Tom Long says, you almost get the feeling that every time Jesus in the Gospel of Luke says the word rich, he snorts. He was rich. And at the very beginning of the Gospel, when Mary learns that she is going to give birth to Jesus, she breaks out into a song that we know as the Magnificat. But the Magnificat is not your usual mother's lullaby. It's a political protest song. My soul magnifies the Lord. Why? Because God is going to bring down the powerful and mighty and lift up the lowly. The poor who are hungry will be filled with good things, and the rich, snort, will be sent away empty. Now, if that's the interpretation of the parable, there's a sense in which it's enormously satisfying. There's a part of us, I think, that wants the rich and the selfish to get to their comeuppance. And whenever I hear of people cheating or cheating others because of greed, I find myself longing for God to give the wealthy villains their comeuppance. But there are two reasons why we shouldn't stop there and why the parable isn't quite that simple. The first is that if I start cheering too loudly for the rich to get what's coming to them, what happens to me if I'm one of the rich? And I might not think of myself as rich, but if I compare my situation with the majority of the world's population, then I have to acknowledge that I'm near the top of the pyramid. And in the narrative world of this parable, there are only two things that make you rich. Number one, that you have enough food to eat each day. And number two, you have a closet full of clothes. If those two things are true about you, then, snort, you are rich. The second reason why we may not want to stop there is that Jesus doesn't stop there. In a story later in Luke's gospel that we will look at next week, there is another rich man named Zacchaeus. But Zacchaeus is not the villain in that story. Instead, Jesus announces that he will dine with Zacchaeus that very day. So just when we think that we have a handle on how God is supposed to treat the rich and the poor, Jesus pulls the rug out from under us. Now, meanwhile, have you figured out the dream yet? Now, it's not the dream where someone is suddenly chasing you, and it's not the dream where all your teeth fall out. It's another dream. Keep thinking about it. You know that dream? Well, we'll get back to that. But going back to the parable, if we decide that today's story is not simply about how the rich get their comeuppance while the poor enjoy good things at last, then how do we understand the riddle that is today's parable? I think that one key can be found in what Father Abraham says to the rich man. "O my child, remember that during your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner evil things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. Besides all this, between you and us a great chasm has been fixed, so that those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so, and no one can cross from there to us." Now, when Abraham begins his speech by saying, "O my child," does that sound to you like the voice of an angry judge? Or does it sound more like the voice of a grieving parent? To me, it sounds more like the voice of a grieving parent. And the loving, grieving parent is saddened by what the rich man has done to himself. The rich man could have bridged that gap between himself and Lazarus, but he didn't. He never reached out to Lazarus. And that gap between the rich man and Lazarus, between the rich and the poor, keeps getting wider until it becomes a very wide chasm. And once it becomes a chasm, it's very difficult to cross. And the danger is that the chasm will become fixed, like it did in today's story. Now listen again to what Abraham tells Dives, the traditional name in Latin for the rich man, which isn't really a name because the word Dives in Latin simply means rich, richy rich. Abraham said, "Between you and us a great chasm has been fixed." The longer that we ignore that chasm, the greater the danger that it will grow and become extremely difficult to cross, if not impossible. A professor once pointed out to me that prior to the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, there were more societies for the abolition of slavery in the southern states than there were in the northern states. But once the cotton gin was invented and slavery became extremely profitable, that chasm between freedom and slavery grew. And it grew so wide that it took a civil war to end it, and in 1,001 ways, we're still fighting that civil war. The fight isn't over yet. And in our own times, we note how the rich keep getting richer. I can remember when Bill Gates was the world's richest man with a comparatively modest fortune of $30 billion. And today, the world's richest man is Elon Musk with a fortune of $343 billion, 10 times Bill Gates' fortune. In our own lives, are we allowing that chasm to keep growing wider? Or are we taking steps to bridge that chasm? Are we making the effort to connect with people whose socioeconomic status is quite different from our own? Ernest T. Campbell was the pastor of New York City's Riverside Church in the early 1970s. And he later published a wonderful and beautiful book of his pastoral prayers. In one of his prayers, he prays for those who are burdened not by too little, but by too much, who have so much leisure that they move like driftwood over the surface of existence, lacking any cause greater than themselves. Moving like driftwood on the surface of existence, lacking any cause greater than themselves. That's the tragic outcome of never trying to bridge that chasm, of never trying to connect with others who might be outside our tax bracket. Now, how can we bridge that chasm? New Testament scholar Luke Timothy Johnson suggests a way that we can bridge that chasm between rich and poor, between our own lives and the lives of others. According to Johnson, the Bible does not contain a strict set of rules about how we should use our money and possessions, or how we should interact with people who have lesser or greater possessions than we do. Instead, Scripture provides a way of thinking about possessions and ourselves that can translate into action depending upon the circumstances. Johnson writes, "This way of thinking begins with an acknowledgement of our own poverty before God. To accept our worth from God as a gift means to dwell in continual nakedness before God in the most radical form of poverty. To dwell in continual nakedness before God. And by the way, that's the dream. That's the dream I was thinking of. That dream where you're suddenly naked in public and you have no idea how that happened, and you're extremely vulnerable. But to be naked and vulnerable before God is not a place of shame, but an opportunity for God to bless us with the blessings that truly matter. Johnson goes on to write, if we stand before God with a poverty that is faith, then we need not cling to any of our possessions as a means of self-definition or self-justification. And the consequences of this should be clear, that we can, for the first time, use things freely. We can also, for the first time, share possessions with others in a variety of ways without being existentially threatened, the way that a 2-year-old might be existentially threatened if asked to share. Now, here ends the quote from Luke Timothy Johnson. The good news of the gospel frees us to have a looser grip on our possessions. Instead of thinking of ourselves as rich who occasionally give out of our excess to help the poor, we can begin to see that rich and poor alike are stewards of what ultimately belongs to God alone. And such mutuality might look something like this. A seminary student goes home for Christmas break and visits with his father, who's the pastor of a downtown church. The two of them decide to walk to a city park, and as they walk, they talk about New Testament ethics and issues of economic justice. And after walking and talking for a while, the father says, hey, it's getting late and we should be getting home by now. I've got an idea. Let's order a pizza, and by the time we get home, it won't be too much longer before it's delivered. So they headed to the nearest phone so that they could call the pizzeria and place the order. Now, this was back in the day before mobile phones were prominent, and there were pay phones on every corner. So the father took out a quarter to pay for the phone call, and just then a man who lived on the streets stepped in front of them, held out his hand and said, can you spare any change? Now, the father and son had just spent a couple of hours talking about economic justice, so they couldn't really say no. So father and son together scraped together all the change they had, and they said, here, take what you need. And the man said, why, thank you. I believe I'll take it all. And as the man walked away, the father realized that he had just given away the quarter that he needed to make the phone call. So the father called out, excuse me, sir, I was about to make a phone call. Could I possibly have a quarter? And the man turned around, held out his hands full of change, and said, sure, here, take what you need. Now, something like that is what can happen when we bridge that chasm. We are no longer enacting one-way charity from the rich and powerful to the poor and vulnerable, but instead, we get to that place where we are extending hands toward each other in mutual generosity, free to share what we have. One more story. Central Presbyterian Church in Atlanta is located in the middle of downtown. And on any given Sunday, you have civic and state leaders in worship, along with people who are unhoused, worshiping together in the sanctuary. One day, the church took up a special collection for victims of an earthquake, and a seminary professor happened to be seated next to someone who was unhoused. And he suddenly worried, like, what's going to happen if I take out my money and make a gift, and the person next to me isn't able to make such a gift? Well, as it turned out, the collection plate came to the man who was unhoused first. And before the plate had come, the man had taken a note from the pew, wrote on it, placed it in the offering plate, and then when it went to the seminary professor, he could see that the man had written, I love you very much. Yet one more example of bridging the chasm, of sharing out of our mutuality and love. All glory and praise be to our God. Amen.